For this project, you're going to need 8 6-foot deck boards. I chose cedar for my wood. I usually like to make the corner pieces first since you need to glue those up, and then while they're drying you can make the other pieces. So for the corners you need 4 pieces at 16.5 inches long. Once you get your corner pieces cut to length, you're going to set your table saw to 2 3/16 inch, and then you're going to run those corner pieces through it. And that's going to give you 2 pieces, one a little wider than the other. And when you glue those together, you'll have a perfectly symmetrical corner. Once you're done at the table saw, you're going to take all your pieces over to your work table, put glue on the smaller one, and you're going to glue that to the wider one. I like to make sure the beveled ends that you're left with when you cut these are on the outside, and that the square ends from the table saw are the sides that you're gluing. I add a few brad nails just to kind of hold it in place. That way when you clamp it, things aren't moving around on you. Once the glue is dry, I'm going to add 3 screws to each corner. All 4 corner pieces are glued up, and while that's drying, we're going to head over to the table saw. You'll need 6 of the 6-foot deck boards for this next step, which is making the sides of the raised bed. I'm cutting 3 of them at a time, which is a little much for my chop saw, but I just have to move those top 2 layers and then I can get through all of it. The size of the garden bed you're making will determine how you cut these 6 deck boards. I want my garden beds to be 48 inches long by about 18 inches wide. So I'm cutting 48-inch pieces and 20-inch pieces. Okay, now to get back to the corner pieces. I'm using these trim head screws. They can be used in treated lumber and outdoors. I like using these for the corners because the screw head will be visible and it's really small, so you're not just going to see these big screws sticking out. I'm thinking the screws really aren't needed. The glue joint should hold, but just in case, the screws will add a little extra insurance. All right, now that the corners are done, I'm going to move on to assembly. And again, I'm switching up my screws. This has a little bigger head on it, and it should kind of pull the boards tightly into the corner pieces. And it's also made for treated wood and outdoor use. I also switched up, and I'm not using wood glue anymore, and I'm using a construction adhesive, and I'll show you later which kind I used. But basically, you're just setting the end pieces of the 3 deck boards, the short deck boards, into the corners and screwing them into place. Both end pieces are done. Now it's time to tie them together with the side pieces. Here I'm showing the construction adhesive that I'm using. It's called Liquid Nails Fuse It. I like this because it's a tan color, so it kind of matches the wood. But I also noticed that when you let the pressure up on the caulking gun, the construction adhesive doesn't continue to come out like I've noticed with other brands. So this seems to be like a lot less messy. This is the same process as before. Basically just put down a bead of the construction adhesive and then screw it together. Here I'm doing the other side, and I kind of switched it around like that because I want to work on the top side of the planter boxes. I want to make sure those are all nice and level and flat with each other to make for a good surface for the top trim piece. Here you can see those last boards weren't getting nice and tight with that corner, so I flipped it on its edge and kind of pulled it down and screwed it in. Okay, the box itself is all done, and you can see how nice and flat that top of the box is, and that'll make for a good glue surface for the top trim, which I'm about to make next. The top trim is the same width I cut those corner pieces with, so you don't need to change the table saw at all. You're just going to cut 2 lengths of it and then cut them to the right size. Now I'm gluing on that trim to the end pieces. I cut it to size so that end trim fits just inside the length of the box, and you'll see why that's important later. I also switched back to those trim screws for a smaller head, so it's not quite as visible. Here I'm measuring the length of the other trim pieces and making sure I cut those correctly. Here's why it was important to cut that first trim piece to the edge. This is a pretty weak joint where the long side pieces meet that corner. There's not much glue surface there. So I want to make sure that trim piece gets glued to that whole end cap, and that kind of strengthens that whole joint up. And I'm going to put caulking on all the surfaces it touches and then screw it in place. And that completes the build. Something else I do when I have the time is I get a clamp and I clamp these top trim pieces together just to make sure that is a good joint so they don't come apart.